All right.
Okay, so last week we had a very spirited discussion on the topic of the Gemara wanted to tell us with regard to Saul Basal that there should be the possibility that it would be acceptable, on and on. And then the Gemara made a chilik between a loan and a sale. So we completed that subject, and now the Gemara goes a little bit further, delving further into understanding what the details are of making a contract for the future. And of course, we said that under certain circumstances, making a contract to receive goods later would be acceptable. So even if the goods increased in price, then it would be acceptable for several reasons. The more we'll go over this again today, but we're going to delve into this a little bit further, and how you can sort of enforce these contracts and make them valid. So we're about I don't know if it was 15 lines or so from on Samach Gimel Omid Beis. It starts with Rabba Rav Yosef, the Amr Travayu. The Gemara says Rabba Rav Yosef, the Amr Travayu. So they both said, in other words, this is obviously not a single position, but from two Amoraim. Haiman de Yod Zuze Asro Harifa. So let's go back and understand something. We've talked about the whole subject of having a fixed price, right? Yotza Hashar, having a fixed price. So the Gemara really tells us that the fixed price doesn't necessarily come in the beginning of the harvest season because it's too early. So a Yotza Shar is a price that comes during the season when they're selling, let's say, the Tavua or whatever it happens to be. Then there's a settling of the price, and that's Yotza Hashar. That's when the price becomes fixed, and you can maneuver around it. So what happens if Reuben comes to Shimon? Shimon's a farmer, and Reuben says, "Here's money for produce." And at that point, the price is much lower. So it's an interesting expression. It's lower because the marketplace is, so to speak, flooded with the produce that Aniyim, who had leket, shicha, and peah, in other words, the fields had to be harvested, so the gleanings of the field, the Aniyim were able to take, and they took leket, shicha, and peah. So they took that and they sold it for money. They sold it in the marketplace. So at that point, they had to discount prices because no one was going to pay large amounts of money. So they discounted the prices. So those are what's called the Atara Harif, sort of the early price of produce, because it's clearly not the price that's going to be established for the marketplace. So what happens if Reuven buys such items from the farmer? Now the farmer has produce, but he's seeing that the Aniyim are selling it for a low price. He can't sell for a higher price because they won't buy from him. So he has to lower his price to match the price of the people who are selling it, kind of like not en masse because the Aniyim didn't have large amounts, but whatever they had, they sold. So the farmer now had to match that price. So the Gemara says, if a person, Reuben, comes to Shimon the farmer, and he wants to buy the produce in the very early stages of the harvest, so again, we'll understand this more fully in a minute, but once he buys it from the farmer, remember, he's buying from the farmer. He's not buying it from the Aniyim. He's buying it from the farmer, but the farmer has to match the price of the Aniyim. So he says he has to come to the threshing floor. In other words, he has to come to the farmer's place of business where he's taking the teruah. In those days, they didn't, they just collect the teruah, they threshed it, and they did a whole bunch of things. So he has to come to the threshing floor, and he has to sort of review the produce. And by that, he confirms the sale. Okay, that's the position of Rabbi Yosef. So in order to consummate the sale, he has to go to the place of business, inspect it, and that completes the sale. All right. So now let's talk about another inyan before we go further. When there are several stages at which a buyer and seller can interact. If a buyer comes to a seller and says to him orally, I want to buy 100 bushels of your grain. Okay, so all he's done is say it. He's done anything else. Okay, that's one level. And we're going to understand those levels when we go through this Gemara. The next level is, he says, I want to buy 100 bushels, and here's $100. So now he's paid for the bushels, not just verbal, but it's actually money. Is there a kinyan? Not yet. The third level is he comes to the farmer, the Shimon, and he says, okay, I'm going to make a kinyan on what I bought, and he does Mashiach or Hagbal, whatever the kinyan is. That's when he finally owns the produce. When he is Mekabel kinyan, that's when the produce becomes his, because in the previous two stages, it's sort of preliminary. He didn't really buy it. Even when he gave the money, the question is, what did he do? He gave the money. Okay, that's very good. But the halacha says that in metaltalin, the only way to acquire metaltalin is not with mammon, it's with kinyan. So clearly you have to pay for it, but it's the kinyan that makes the effect. So those are the three things we need to sort of understand as we go through this Gemara. That's how we're going to view this. So the Gemara now asks a kasha on Rabbi Yosef. Lamai, you, Rabbi Yosef, said that you have to come and inspect it, and you have to, that's when you confirm the sale. Lemikna, why does he have to come and inspect it, the Gemara? Lemikna, if it is to actually buy the grain, halokana. He hasn't made Mekabel kinyan. So what's the point of the showing up? That's what the question is. If you're going to say it's to make a kinyan, halokana, right? He by coming to the threshing floor, he doesn't do anything because he has not made Mekabel kinyan. Now, if you remember, a while back, we talked about the end of Mishapara. Mishapara is a censure that people get for doing certain events. It's not strictly osir, but since there's a Mishapara, people they get very nervous about getting a Mishapara, and they'll go out of their way not to have the Bezdin issue a Mishapara. And Mishapara can come in a variety of different things. One of the ways a Mishapara happens is if one of the parties in a sale backs out before the kinyan, before the consummation of the deal, then the Bezdin can issue a Mishapara. Why? Because we're not talking about stage one, where I said to you, let's make a purchase. No, I gave you money. But the halacha is that's not a kinyan. So I gave you money, and then I changed my mind. I say, you know what? Either the buyer or the seller, it could be either way, says, I don't want to go through with it. Either maybe because the price rose and the seller wants to get a better price, or because the buyer says, I don't need it right now. Whatever the reason, he wants to back out. There, the Bezdin can issue a Mishapara, which obviously is very, it affects people. And people don't want to have that censure because it's known in the public that they got a Mishapara. So, says the Gemara here, what's the purpose of showing up? If you show up to make the magnet to buy it, although Kone, he didn't make a kinyan. So showing up has no point. And now, ilikabu alei mishapara. And if the purpose is to say that the sale is consummated, so that if the let's say the seller says I don't want to sell, then you make a mishapara. In other words, could that be the reason that's the signal because he showed up, even though the kinyan wasn't made, even though he showed up, that's enough for a mishapara. Right. So the Gemara says kilo miskan kabel olei mishapara. That also can't be the reason why. Because a mishapara can happen after the monetary portion of the transaction. That's sort of the mid-level, not the kinyan. So if he got money and then he's coming to the threshing floor, the money already created the atmosphere for mishapara. And so if the seller backs out after the money, he gets a mishapara. So why does he need to show up? In other words, what's the real point of showing up if it can't increase the understanding of what the deal is about? It seems superfluous. Why does he have to show up?
Isn't, I mean, maybe this is crazy, but isn't it
A
simple?
little louder, Michael.
Is this better? Can you hear me better?
Much better.
I'm sorry. I need to be closer to the mic. Okay, so it seems just obvious that he wants them to go there because he wants to see exactly what he's getting. I mean, because if I'm not at the threshing floor, I can substitute a grade. If I'm not there to see it, then I can't tell exactly. I'm paying for this grade of merchandise, and if I don't inspect it there, then it can be held out that I didn't actually pay for that. So isn't that? I mean, maybe that's crazy, but it's an obvious reason to force them to be there.
So I would say you're right, Michael, that you want to inspect the goods before you make the purchase. But Rabba and Rabbi Yosef are saying more than that. They're saying he comes to the threshing floor to inspect, but through the inspection he certifies the sale. So it isn't just inspecting for the purpose of inspecting to see that the goods are good and that they're not, they're not rotten or whatever, but they attach to that a confirmation of the sale by doing the inspection. So it isn't inspection just for the sake of inspection, it's inspection for the sake of validating the sale. That's what Rabbi Yosef come to introduce.
But the inspection is not a method of kinyan. So, the fact that you inspect it is great, but you have not made a kinyan, right?
But that's exactly the point. So because Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef said that it confirms the sale, the Gemara asks, how does it confirm the sale? A, they didn't make a kinyan, and B, for the mishapara. That's exactly the point. The point that Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef are saying gives rise to the question, so what's the point? The sale
is it's not as simple as, hey, I might substitute a different grade of goods, so I want to see exactly what I'm buying, so that to give deference to the buyer that he's getting what he wants to be getting is a requirement, because things didn't take place remotely. Then you wanted to inspect the goods, so isn't that as simple as it is?
He could have sent an inspector to just be sure. If he has any doubt about the goods, why would he want to go there himself? We'll send somebody over there and say, hey, why don't you watch the process? I want to be sure I'm getting what I'm paying for.
But
there's an option here for his concern. It also doesn't mean he's taking kinyan or he's certifying anything. He's sending an inspector over.
Right. So to that point, if the only purpose of going was to do the inspection, then you're right. Okay. He needs to go because he needs to inspect, right? He needs to make sure he's getting the right product. But Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef are saying more than that. He didn't go just to inspect to make sure he was getting the right product. He went to sort of seal the sale. That's the key here, that Rabbi and Yosef are adding another reason why he went, not just for inspection.
We don't know if that's in his intent. Well, how can they define the intent of the buyer when they don't know what his intent
No,
is?
no. So Rabbi and Yosef are saying that if Reuven bought from Shimon in the early stages of the season, right, when there's no fixed price, there's not a fixed price, and they paid him whatever he paid him, there's a requirement that he go to the threshing floor, inspect, and that seals the sale. So Rabbi and Yosef are making a pronouncement that in the circumstance where you buy early in the market price, in the early part of the market, you have to do this. You have to go, you have to inspect, and then that sort of seals the sale. So it's not just because of the inspection. It's because of the inspection leading to the confirmation of the sale, which is why the Gemara asks those questions. If it was just for inspection, I would say you're right. No problem. He has to go inspect. That's the very logical thing to do. But Rabbi is saying it's an inspection and a confirmation of the sale. Back to Gemara, what confirmation of sale? If it was a confirmation of sale, he had to do a kinyan, right? And so there's no kinyan here, right? There's no kinyan. And in the Kabbalah Mishapara, and if it's for the purpose of being the Kabbalah Mishapara, he lo misyabe nama mishapara. Then even if it didn't appear, there's a mishapara. Why? Because he paid money. So no matter how you slice it, there's no reason for him to come to inspect, because the inspection alone does nothing. Then this is a confirmation of sale. Why bother inspecting?
When did he start? When did we start with the money here in this transaction?
When he approached the farmer and he said, I want to buy your early produce, and he gave him money. He gave him the money. Now, is that a kinyan? No. Is it more than a verbal? Yes.
But I'm troubled by that conversation. He gave him a fixed amount of money. There were assumptions obvious between the two of them, how much he's going to get and how much it's going to cost for how much he's going to get. It's not just here's $100,000. I want to buy a portion of your field when it's ready.
But why can't
It's
it
not like a deposit because there's no.
Either Michael or Jay, one of you said he could have sent an inspector. Why did he have to show up? He could have sent an inspector just to inspect, to make sure he was buying the right produce. And that's okay. But the Gemara doesn't say that. The Gemara says that the buyer himself has to show up. Why? To inspect and that confirms the sale. So the showing up is not just because there's an inspector who's making sure he's getting the right produce, it's because the buyer himself needs to show up for the inspection and to say, we have a sale.
But there's something still missing before the buyer shows up. What's missing here is how much is he buying? How much is he going to get for the money that he had in his pocket and he gave over to the farmer?
Right. So that's not really so much of a question, because you can assume here in this particular case that orally they said, I'm giving you $100 and I want 100 bushel. I mean, that part is not written, but we have to assume that they had a conversation and they came to terms. But that was only the very first level that we talked about, is between you and me, we have a conversation. What does that do? It does nothing. Not even a mishapara. I mean, we just talked. So now that we talk and I'm giving you money, so the Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi say, you know what, you got to show up, you got to look at the produce, make sure it's what you're getting, not through a shaliach, you yourself, and by you personally showing up, that's the confirmation of the sale. If you sent the shaliach to inspect, that wouldn't do anything, because that's not what's needed to move it to the next level. It's you, the buyer, who has to show up in order to move it to the next level. That's
what's troubling. What's troubling about that, it says you confirmed the sale, but he has not made an acquisition. So
no, he hasn't. True, he hasn't made the kinyan yet.
Right,
but
verbally, you're saying he shows up, he confirms the sale.
And
but
gives
he's
money,
not,
and gives money.
but he has not made the Kinyan yet. So his
Correct.
showing up alone is not the Kinyan. If he makes a Kinyan while he's there, then that might confirm the sale. So I don't
Right.
understand
So
why
he didn't
showing
make the
up
kinyan.
confirms
Right.
the sale.
So this pronouncement of Rabbi Yosef is what the Gemara says we don't understand. What was the whole function of the buyer coming to the seller to inspect and to confirm the sale? There's still, like you just said, there still is no sale. There was no kinyan. So he didn't make a kinyan when he came to the threshing floor. He just looked around, saw what he saw. Okay, I like it. Here's $100. Goodbye. I'm going home. And so the Gemara says, so what did he do? What did he do here that required him to come to the threshing floor? Because you made the point before, someone else could have come. True. We're requiring him to come. So if he comes, this is already a big deal. He's coming to inspect his goods and give money. What's the point?
So,
Nothing happened.
okay,
That
so
money didn't do anything for him.
maybe
It
we're
didn't buy
missing
him the
something.
goods.
Yeah, maybe we're missing something that wasn't said. By him showing up, he's confirming that he's the number one buyer. A
Correct.
number two buyer doesn't have any chance to buy this stuff now because
Correct.
the number one showed up. Otherwise, somebody else can come since there's no Kenyan and the sale's not complete, just like what Michael says. He says, look, I'll give you 50% more. I want to have this now. And the seller has no reason not to sell it to the number two buyer. He has no commitment to the number one because he just has money and he can return the money. There's no Kenyan made.
Yeah, but that's where the Mishapara comes in. That's where the Mishapara comes in. That a seller would not likely say to the buyer, "Here's your money. I'm selling it to him," because he doesn't want that Mishapara. So it's not just simply, I'm going to switch horses midstream and I sell it to somebody else. That sale to somebody else really gives rise to a very serious matter, which he does not want to have over him. He doesn't want a Mishapara over his head that he reneged on the deal. So, but again, let's go back and analyze. Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef made a statement, and they said, under the circumstances where you buy early in the season, step one, early in the season. So what have you done? Okay, you go to the threshing floor, you inspect the goods, you give him the money, and that confirms the sale. What does it mean to confirm a sale? Okay, we now know, having spoken about the levels of the level of how we do this, is that money is only the second step. First step is talking. Second step is money. Third step is kinyan. Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef don't say you have to make a kinyan here. They say you just have to give the money, and now you have a sale. Correct the Gemara. Why? Money alone, we know, doesn't do anything. That's the kasha. You want to tell me that money and inspection make the deal. That's not true. You need a kinyan, and there was no kinyan. Or alternatively, you know why the Gemara says he showed up? In order for the seller to incur a mishapara if he sells it to someone else. But that's already built in by the fact that he gave him the money. He doesn't have to inspect to give him the money. He can just say, here, Shimon, here's the money. He doesn't have to show up. So by giving him the money, that's good enough. Why does Rabbi Yosef say he has to inspect it and give the money? In other words, it's superfluous to say he has to inspect it. Again, we said before, someone else can inspect it, but here we're requiring him to inspect and to give the money. That's the kasha. Why does he have to do both of those things when there was no kinyan, and B, there already is a mishapara? So what else is left? All right, what else is left? The inspector could say, Reuven, you're buying first-class goods, don't worry about it. Okay, good. Now, I'm going to go make a kinyan, and I'll have it. But he hasn't made the kinyan yet, so the inspection seems to be superfluous to what we need to do here. That's the Gemara's thinking, right? Because the Mishapara would happen even without the inspection because of the exchange of money. So that's the kasha. Right, let's look a little bit further. I mean, there's some questions here back and forth, but I think what we need to understand is that Rabbi and Yosef are linking an inspection and money, and that's where the problem arises. Why do you have to have an inspection and money? You can have money alone without the inspection, and he doesn't have to purchase the money. He can send with a shaliach, and he doesn't have to come and inspect. He's a busy guy. He sends his shaliach to inspect. Rabbi Yosef says no. He personally has to come down and do it. So we're trying to understand what are they getting at when they're saying that the buyer has to show up. So the Gemara says as follows: the olam lekabale mishapara. So we're going to go back and say that when Reuven, who is the buyer, comes to see the produce, that's what kicks off the mishapara, right? So according to this teretz, paying money alone doesn't make a mishapara. In other words, the Gemara's assumption was a mishapara would happen just with the money. Says the Gemara, la'olam lekabel mishapara. You need the inspection. You need the inspection. He has to show up in order for the mishapara to take effect if there is a problem. So now that counters what we originally thought mishapara was. We thought a mishapara was enough if you just paid the money. Teretz is Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef are coming to give us a chidush. Paying the money alone is not sufficient. In order for there to be a mishapara, you have to pay money and show up. Okay, even not kinyan. You haven't been made a kinyan yet, but you have to just show up. That's the chidush of Rabbi Yosef. That's how you make a mishapara. Because the Reuven who gave the money for the early purchase, the Beitrei Klosa Yoyer, right? So now the Gemara is going to introduce something here. That person, that must have been the custom at the time. Let's say Shimon was a farmer. Let's say Levi and Yehuda were also farmers, and they were all competing for the business, right? And each one in the early stage of the process is willing to sell it at a lower price. So what does Reuven do? Reuven goes to Shimon, goes to Levi, and goes to Yehuda. And each of them, he says, here's some money. I'm going to buy. You know, they have an early price, they have an early produce, and he wants to buy. So the custom that was the custom, that they went lebeitrei talosa yoyer, that they used to go to 2 or 3 sellers, maybe even more, and make this deal. And who are they going to buy from at the end? Well, that depends. So if he then comes to inspect some chadata, then he relies on that seller, or I should say the seller relies on that buyer, that he is going to buy by him. And if not, there's a mishapara. So in other words, the showing up is to certify which seller he is going to go with. And the sellers don't necessarily know this. I mean, they know in theory he's gone window shopping to a lot of different farmers, but how do they know they're going to make the deal? You know when they're going to make the deal? When he shows up.
Rabbi, I have 2 questions to clarify.
Yeah.
So the money that's placed down is considered a deposit at that point.
Correct.
So that nothing's happened with the money. There's
Correct.
And so he could deposit with 3 different people and say,
Correct.
who do I want to buy from?
Correct.
So, but I want to go back to Jay's point earlier, which is, why does he have to show up? There are many people who use agents to purchase stuff. So why is it the buyer himself, and why can't he use an agent to show up on his behalf?
But that's the chiddush of Rabbi Rav Yosef. Rabbi Rav Yosef are making a statement that, you're right. Why send the shaliach? Why does he have to waste his time? So they're instituting a requirement. This is a requirement now. They're saying a requirement that in order to clarify what's going on in the market, you can't just send a shaliach to go around from farmer to farmer to farmer. You yourself, the gravitas of your showing up makes the statement that I'm making the deal. So yes,
But
of
that
course you
doesn't
can send
happen in real life.
it.
Even at that time, there may have been someone's a merchant who's a wholesaler, and he may sell retail, and he may have buyers, in his business that go there. Why does it have to be that the person whose money is behind it has to show up? What is their rationale behind that? Are we going to learn that?
Yeah, yeah. No, I understand your thinking here. Your thinking is, there's other means of being able to make this transaction without the buyer personally showing up. So maybe in theory that's correct. Maybe in theory you can send a shaliach. The shaliach can do all the work. But to get to the bottom line, to say what are the shaliach is going to go to seller one, seller two, seller three. This is where, and this is the teretz. This is what enforces Rabbi Yosef, is that all of this is sort of like it's a game. It's a game. The buyer goes and he wants to see where he can get the best price. So he goes to multiple sellers. Remember, there's no a fixed price yet. So he says, let me go and get an early price. Maybe another seller will give me even a better price than the first guy. So he's really sort of fishing for the best opportunity. Says Rabbi Yosef, under those circumstances, where a buyer is going out there to explore what kind of deal he should make, we're imposing upon him the requirement to do it personally. You could argue and say why, but that's Rabbi Yosef's statement. That's the chiddush they're bringing to the table, that when you have this kind of circumstance, remember, it's only when there is no fixed price. It's early in the season. Everything is kind of hefker. This guy's selling, that guy's
There's
selling.
an assumption of what the price range will be. So it's
No.
not totally open.
Well, it's not totally open, but who says it has to be this price? Maybe it's slightly better because another seller is anxious. He has a bigger volume and he wants to sell more. So in other words, you're not dealing with a hard and fast number that everybody can agree on. We're dealing with what's in the best interest of the seller. This seller may have one interest, and another seller may say, no, I have a different interest, therefore I'm going to sell at this price. The point that Rabbi Yosef are making to us is that without showing up, you are not confirming to the seller that you want to buy from him. Therefore, the seller is in limbo. Do I have a customer? Do I not have a customer? Yeah, he gave me a deposit, but he's not going to be penalized if he removes it. There's no mishapara.
But Rabbi, it's also possible that in your earlier example, there are three buyers. All three show up at the same time, and they start a bidding war.
No. It's not an auction. He goes to one farm, then he goes to a second farm, then he goes to a third farm. He is not bringing them all together and saying, let's have a bidding. He's going to them individually so that Shimon, the first farmer, doesn't know if he went to Levi or Levi and Yehuda or more. In other words, each one of those sellers is a separate guy, and he doesn't know what the buyer has done. Has the buyer gone only to me, or has he gone to others? I'm going to assume he went to others, but it's not like an auction, Michael, where everybody comes together.
Yeah, but Rabbi, it's not what you're saying. It's not not the seller is going to them, the buyer is going to the seller.
Correct.
If other buyers show up, what can potentially happen? Again, no kinyan has taken place. There's no market price established. So everything is on the table. And so if three people show up at the same time, they've all put deposits down. They're all, they can barter for the price. It's in the seller's advantage to have multiple people show up to try
Correct.
to get the best price.
Correct.
So when the reverse, I mean, you're saying that the buyer goes and visits multiple sites, but there's a competition for people who are the early birds because they know the marketplace. And so what could potentially happen with them showing
I
up is
thought
if
we
we
gave.
So in that particular case, Michael, there would also not be a mishapara if the seller says, I want buyer number 2. In other words, the seller is in the same position as the buyer. It's in a gray area until a deal is done. So the Gemara wants to tell us that when the buyer goes to A, B, or C, that the sellers don't know. Therefore, there's no mishapara until he comes to the seller that he wants to buy from. But you're right. The same is true in reverse. If the seller gets multiple buyers and they give him deposits, he could say, I want to give it to Zavulun, who's a buyer. I don't want to give it to Ruvain. I want to
and
give
that's
it to
his
Zavulun.
right,
The
correct?
buyer, but the buyer, one second, I thought the buyer gave money early, right at
They
the
all
early
did, but in my
conversation.
example, they all did.
He gave deposits to all of the.
Okay, but money exchanged earlier in the conversation.
It says Rava and Rabbi Yosef, money alone doesn't matter until he shows up. In other words, the reverse is now true. I gave you some money. I didn't make a Kenyan. I gave Levi. I gave Yehuda. I gave them all some money, but no one has a deal yet. When does someone know he has a deal? When the guy shows up. He could have sent the money with a shliach. That's not a problem.
But the buyer can go around and give deposits to 5 different farmers.
Exactly.
Correct. That was the Metzias at the time.
And then if he goes and he looks at the threshing floor and all
he may
five,
like someone else's better, right? He may like someone else's better.
where is he? If he gave 5 deposits, he went to visit the 5 farms to look at what's going on. Then what's going on here?
No. He didn't come to visit. He just sent the money. He sent money.
No, but the next stage is they're saying he has to go and visit.
So the visit is what certifies the deal.
But it doesn't certify the deal because there's no Kenyan yet.
No. Correct. There's no Kenyan, but the money and the visit certify the mishapara.
But he could have visited the other farms also, right. The ones that he gave money to.
No, because the first one that he visits, that's the deal.
No, it's not, because he can decide not to make a Kenyan there.
No, but okay. So he can decide not to make a Kenyan, you're correct. But then if he visits with the guy and he's already given him the money, that gives rise to the mishapara, which he certainly doesn't want. You're right, Michael. There's no Kenyan yet, but there could be a mishapara, and that's what
why would the Bezdin write a mishapara when this buyer knowingly is going to go visit a couple of farms and he gave deposits to a couple of different farms?
Yeah, but
the Bezdin doesn't have any need to do anything here.
So this starts a bidding war. I mean, the way you're describing it, you're saying that as a minimum, according to Rabba and Rabbi Yosef, as a minimum requirement, you got to lay money down. The money is a deposit. It's not an acquisition. It's a deposit at that point in time.
Correct.
Then if you want to buy, you got to show up in person to qualify. If you don't show up in person, you can't buy. But if multiple people show up in person, the seller can pick the highest.
No, it's the first person. It's the first person.
No, it's not. They all show up at the same time.
Okay, if they show up at the same time, then you're right.
If I'm a seller, why wouldn't I want to start a bidding war? Have all of them come at 10 in the morning or whatever time, 7 in the morning, and start a bidding war as to what price it is, so I can maximize my return.
Okay, so that's exactly what Rabba and Rabbi Yosef are telling us we want to avoid. In other words, here are the rules of the game. The rules of the game is you send your shaliach. Now we're talking about a shaliach, Mike. Send your shaliach, and he goes to Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, maybe more, and he gives them all a deposit. They all want 10%, they give a deposit. Okay, but the buyer, Reuben, hasn't shown up. He just sent the shaliach to send the money. Now, And that was perfectly acceptable at the time. In other words, you can do that. Now, in order to avoid what you're just saying, that there shouldn't be a machlokes, a bidding war, and everything else, we didn't want a bidding war. We want there to be a
Why
straight
not? Why doesn't the seller want a bidding war?
because that's the point. Rabbi Yosef was saying that, look, you're right. If all of them literally show up at the same time, then the seller has to make a decision who he's going to sell to. And maybe someone says, I'll pay more. That's all sort of out there. But in the classic case where he sent money to everybody and then says, now I'm going to decide who I want to buy from because I'm going to show up, says the Gemara, that's the reason why showing up is important, because then he certifies who he is, who the real seller is, who he's buying from. At that point, we can institute the Mishapara because he has at least made the two steps necessary.
No, he shows up because you have people showing up because they want to check the quality of the product. That doesn't confirm anything because he can still go and end up buying at a second farm because he gave 5 deposits. The fact that he showed up to the first one that he gave the money to still doesn't have any power. Like Michael says, there's no Kenyan, there's no deal. There's just a deposit which would be returned to 4 out of the 5 people.
Rabbi, why
I get more confused. I'm sorry.
Why, if I'm a seller, wouldn't I want that? You may not, Rabbi and Rav Yosef may not want that. But if I'm a seller and I can take deposits from multiple people and I can choose who I want, wouldn't I want them all there at the same time? There's no market price established. It's my best time because they're buying early, they're getting in early. Why wouldn't I want them all there and to start a bidding war? That's what I would want to do as the seller. And
so they're taking the side of
that.
But they're taking the side of the buyer here. That's the clue.
Yeah, that's the point.
They're not taking the side of the
seller. They can take the side, but it's not against halacha to do what the seller's wanting to do. Why wouldn't he do that? If I was a sophisticated seller, that's what I would do.
Look, at that time, you're right. If the seller was in a position where he had multiple people coming at the same time, so you can't say that one person made the imprimatur of showing up and therefore should be the buyer. Then you're right. Under that circumstance, you don't have Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi's halacha of showing up being the sort of the certification because you have 3 people showing up. But again, in the example of the Gemara of Rabbi Yosef, that's not what happened. In your case, you're right, Michael. If that happened, it happened.
But Rabbi, realistically, even back in those times, you had someone who had lots of land and grew it. Wouldn't they sell it? They would sell it to a wholesaler buyer who would sell it retail. So this is sophisticated purchasing by people who know the industry,
right?
And they would want to make it such that the seller maximizes his return. The buyer is trying to get in early to get the best produce at an equivalent price. So he's this is the free market system, and it doesn't seem like the Gemara is against the free market system.
Right.
They don't want the buyer to get screwed. Right. But in this case, the buyer would naturally get.
Okay, so let's hold off on that discussion to see whether the Gemara addresses your hypothesis that the seller is the one who wants to drum up more business. So what is he doing? He's making an announcement. I'm going to have an auction on Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock, and I want all the buyers to show up. That's a different case. That's a different
He doesn't have to say there's an auction.
The seller wants to have competition from buyers.
All of you, I'm selling. You need deposits on file. I want all of you to come at X amount. He's got enough, he's got enough produce coming that it's a matter of levels of, and he's going to have different levels of quality. So I want all of you to come at the same time. and then you'll tell me what you want, and I'll make a decision on what I'm going to sell to who for what price. I mean,
Right.
that's business.
So,
That's not,
so
there's nothing illegal or immoral about it.
and we're no, and we're not saying there is, but I think Jay said before, we're looking at it from the perspective of the buyer, not the seller. The seller,
Protecting, we're
that's a different
protecting the
case.
buyer. It sounds like we're protecting their interest. The
Right.
Rabbanim is to protect the buyer.
Project the buyer. That's exactly right.
And
Well,
they,
it
they
is
know the
protecting them, but
seller's
it may
okay,
not.
but they're
So,
not.
Michael, are not wrong by saying what the seller can do. The seller can hold an auction and he could say, I want the best price.
Different
But,
case.
right.
Not
But
this
Robert,
But
case.
it's not an auction. This is not, I mean, it's saying,
I'm
okay,
using the word auction loosely. I don't mean an auction. I mean, he can talk to multiple buyers and then make his decision. But Robert Rabbi Yosef want to understand why the buyer has to show up in order to certify a deal. That's the focus of Rabbi Yosef.
but what they're
So
overlooking
the
is that
question about them is, what are they afraid of that they're making the buyer show up? So that's the other side. Are they afraid of other buyers? Are they afraid of something? Otherwise, they're not insisting that he show up.
Well, they want to make sure he's not a fraud, that he's just, that he's just mouthing off and saying, I want to buy something and not doing anything. Remember, level one is I come to you and I say, I want to buy. You say to me, I want to sell. What good is that? That doesn't do anything.
But that would mean that you would restrict them under Rabbi Rav Yosef's theory. You would restrict the seller to only allow one buyer to come at that time.
Correct.
And make an appearance in person, and he selected it in advance, even though there are deposits on file, which is not in the seller's best interest. It may be protecting the buyer, but because there's been no market price established,
Correct.
and the goods are not, what I don't understand, he comes to the threshing floor, but it's early. The season is not done. They haven't grown. There's no price established. So coming to the threshing floor, he's not going to see the product that he's buying.
But the other question is, why are the two Rabbanim not trying to protect the sellers also? Why are they focused only on protecting the buyer?
Well, I think in this particular situation, they're presenting what might have been the more prevalent situation at the time.
Yeah.
I don't think they're necessarily protecting the buyer, but they're saying that there are so many sellers out there who are all trying to make a deal. So this buyer, can he mislead the sellers? Can he just go and have every seller sort of at his beck and call? Says Rabbi Yosef, no, he can't. He can at least put down a deposit, and maybe other people are putting a deposit too. So each of those sellers is now waiting for a buyer to walk through the door. When he walks through the door, now they know they have a deal. But otherwise, it seems like the buyer is in a better position than the seller, because the sellers there's multiple sellers. How many buyers are there? There may not be that many buyers at the time. So in order for the buyer to commit himself, he not only has to give the money, but he has to show up for the inspection. Now, your point, Michael, is that he should inspect beforehand, and therefore the inspection shouldn't be determinative, because what happens if he inspects? There's no question if he inspects and the produce is foul or deteriorated or spoiled, there's no deal. We at least make the assumption that all the produce that's being threshed, that's being prepared from the field, is roughly equal. We have to make that assumption, because you're right. If he comes in and he says, I'm inspecting, but this is inferior produce, then there is no inyan. He could walk away and he could say no deal. But if he comes to inspect and the inspection passes muster, let's say, because that we're going to assume that, then because he has deposited with different people, the chiddush of Rabbi Yosef is that, you know what? He can do that. He can go from seller to seller, but only when he shows up. Because the question is, why show up? Remember, that was the original question.
Okay,
Why
so-
are we requiring him to show up? The
So I-
answer is because showing up means he wants to buy from this seller, not from another seller.
Okay, so I made a mistake when I think I made a mistake when I said they're protecting the buyer. In effect, they're protecting both because
Yeah.
I don't agree,
the
Jay. I
seller
don't think they're
doesn't
protecting
have
the seller.
anybody yet. The seller's happy to get an early purchaser.
Correct.
And
But
so by them declaring Rabbi Yosef that he has to go and make his present known,
Right.
it's a win-win for the seller and the buyer.
Correct.
So
see, I don't view it that
wrong by
way.
saying they're protecting only the buyer.
I don't view it that
Protecting
way.
both.
I mean, we saw this with the Malva and the Lova. The Malva can, as long as the Lova makes out okay, the Malva, it doesn't matter what happens to him because he's got the money and he can lend, and we're going to protect the Lova. It's the same thing here. If I'm a seller, I'm not going to limit myself in that situation. So I'm not going to look for a buyer that is a new buyer or someone who's that way. I'm going to look for someone who is a known buyer. If I'm, if I have the best goods, I make the market in this or one of the market makers in this. I'm going to try to get the best deal for myself because that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to set it up. So that's what I have. So a buyer is not, I'm not going to limit myself to one buyer. I mean, if it's a mom pop farm, maybe that's a different story, but it works in the opposite. Maybe it was different then, but the human mind is such that the seller's going to want to get his best deal, and he's not going to do anything that's going to limit that ability to get his best deal. So in the end, the buyer is not getting
But
getting.
Michael, I think what's confusing here is that you want to focus on the seller and what his options are. And the Gemara here is trying to support the ruling of Rabbi Yosef. Why does a buyer have to show up? Forget about anything else. Why does a buyer have to show up to make a deal? Let him just send the money, let a shaliach go, all fine and good. So the Gemara is saying, you know why he has to show up? Because in this circumstance, he is allowed to make deposits to multiple sellers, and those sellers, they're in a bind because they have a deposit. So are they allowed to just freely say, I don't want this deposit? Maybe there's a mishapara. Maybe there's a mishapara because they have a deposit. Says the Gemara that, you know what? The buyer is the one who will determine all of this. It's a finite number of farmers. We're not talking about hundreds. The finite number of farmers. He can go to multiple farmers. He's definitely going to make an acquisition, but from whom? So says the Gemara, when he shows up for the inspection, and we're going to assume the inspection it's not foul, it's not deteriorated. That's an assumption of the Gemara. So, but if he shows up and does the inspection and it passes muster, that's proof positive that he's making a deal with this particular farmer. And therefore, and we'll just see the next lines in the Gemara, the other farmers hear about that. They can now say, okay, we're now free to make a deal with somebody else. Here's your money back. We can make a deal with somebody else. There's no mishapara. The whole Indian here is the aura of a mishapara that is going to affect these people. So
I understand that.
Step by step.
I just want to make one last point, and that is the seller, in response to that, is going to take on a bunch of deposits. If I'm a seller, that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
And then I can choose based on the price that I offer. And if I make an appearance and I can say, let me think about that, hold on to that, and then he can allow the rest of the people who have deposits on hand to come and make the best deal for himself, then make the sale there and return everybody else's deposit.
Correct.
So
that's correct.
I
And it
don't
would
see
not be
how
a
that's
mishapara.
benefiting the buyer unless you restrict and say, once you allow the buyer to make an appearance, you must sell if he's agreeable to buy.
Right.
If you do that, then you've accomplished your objective. Otherwise, you haven't.
Right. But by the same token, the seller can accept more than one deposit.
Right.
Now, the seller will say, who am I selling to? The minute a buyer walks through the door to inspect, he has a deal with that buyer, and he can return the money to the other prospective purchasers without a mishapara because they didn't show up. So truthfully, the halacha works both ways. We're focused on the purpose of the visit, and the visit certifies the fact that he's making a decision with this seller and not another seller. But to your point, if the sellers are out there and there's a buyer, more than one buyer who wants to put a deposit down, he's not limited to one deposit because that deposit is not a deal yet. It's still talking.
And he can have them all show up at the same time and say,
again, the showing up at the same time is what's creating your problem here. So
but if I'm a seller, wouldn't I?
No. So let's just say the halacha is if they all show up at the same time, the seller has the opportunity to say, I want to deal with Ruvain and not with Levi or with Yisachar or Zebulun, whatever. In other words, yes, if they all show up at the same time, so that there is not an imprimatur of a deal with one person, because three people literally are doing the same thing. He's not mechuyev on all three. I mean, he can say, I'm going to sell it to all of you, but if he only wants to sell to one, then at that point, he has to make a decision. Who am I selling to?
But Rabbi,
and there's nothing wrong with that, because Rabbi Yehuda are not saying that there's something wrong if the seller chooses buyer A instead of buyer B. They're only saying that the showing up is what creates the deal. In your hypothesis, there's three people showing up at the same time. So, okay, now
but he has the option to say, who's going to give me $150 for this 100 bushels?
Right.
And if and so since if two of the three say, yeah, I won, I'll give you that, then it sparks a bidding war, which is against what the Torah wants here.
Well, look, the Torah wants a fair marketplace. So to your point, if I will tell you that if the three buyers show up at the same time, each has a deposit, and he says, I don't know who to pick, so my price is now 150 instead of 100. Who wants it? Okay, they can all three say we want it. One can say I want it, the other two not, and that creates a marketplace. There's nothing wrong with what you're just saying. It's because the Gemara doesn't talk about three people showing up at the same time. You have a different hypothetical, which, okay, we have to deal with that hypothetical separately. And in that particular case, each deposit is not a deal until the seller makes a decision who he's selling to, because they all showed up at the same time. But that's not our situation.
I understand that, but you're dealing here with Ona, that the price is not set. Right. It's early in the season. The price is not set, means all bets are off. You can do whatever you want. Until the market price is set, you have a danger zone. And if I'm the seller, I'm going to take advantage of that danger zone. So I don't see how this does anything.
Our problem here is we have the same situation as if there was a price set. The fact that he's coming in and making that payment means he's not getting the produce now. He's going to get the produce in 2 months. What happens if the price goes up in 2 months? Does he have a deal and there's no ribbis? That's still what we're really getting at, is if he does an early purchase where there's no price set, says the Gemara here is telling us that if he shows up to certify the deal, no kinyan yet, because there's nothing to make a kinyan on. He doesn't have the finished product. It's all being threshed. So if he puts the money down and he shows up, then later on, when the finished product is going to be delivered, and then he'll make the kinyan, it's okay if the price went up, no ribbis. So the whole point of this, what we're forgetting about is the ribbis. Is there going to be ribbis? So the Gemara says, if you have no established price and it's an early price, then the only way to avoid ribbis is by giving him money and showing up. And that shows his level of interest. And it's the equivalent of, although it's not the same, it's the equivalent of an established price because he's made that deal at this point in time. Says Rabba and Rabba, okay, now with that in mind, I understand why we have, so the kasha on him was, why show up? The answer is you show up because there were multiple buyers, so there were multiple sellers, and in order for this deal to be confirmed, not consummated, because there's no kinyan. In order for the deal to be confirmed, you have to have him show up, inspect, and say, fine, now I'm going forward. Then he can release the other monies, and if he backs out from this buyer, there's a mishapara. In other words, the whole thing will come together only because we have a different circumstance than if there was a fixed price in the marketplace. Then the minute he gives them, you don't have this circumstance. This circumstance appears because it's an early buy.
But the difference is there's no kinyan. There is no buy.
Right, but we're saying that there's no buy, but giving the money and showing up creates
the deposit. You can return
Michael, the mishapara, remember, we talked about this. The mishapara is a very severe thing. In other words, they say that if a man and a woman get engaged, then if they write tanoim, then the halacha is you really shouldn't break the tanoim. Why? Because it's using Hashem's name. You shouldn't do that. So the couple, according to halacha, should get married and then divorced. That's the halacha. So why is that? Because the tanoim binds you that you shouldn't break it, and there is not a mishapara, but there's a lot of negativity to breaking that tanoim. That's what we have here. We have a buyer and a seller, and the buyer wants to buy. There's no question about it. So, but it's too early to make a kinyan because he has nothing to make a kinyan on. The wheat is being threshed. It's only when it's finished, in its finished state, that's when he can make the kinyan. So the Gemara is asking, if that's the case, then what do we have here? So Rabbi Yosef said, what we have here? We have a buy. We have a buy without a kinyan, but with the concern hovering over us over a mishapara, which is very, very serious. So a buyer is not going to go through these motions and then say later, I want to back out. That's the reason, according to Rabbi Yosef, why the showing up is important, because as the Gemara answers here, if he went to multiple sellers, again, not your situation with a seller with a lot of buyers, no, one buyer went to multiple sellers, gave them each a deposit, and has to decide who he's going to make a deal with. Says the Gemara, when he gives the money for the deposit, it's as if nothing happened. However, if he shows up to one of the farmers, he's got to go to one. I mean, the first one he goes to. You can't go to all three at the same time. So he goes to one, and he makes the deal, and he says, I'm inspecting, and here's the money. They gave the money. Then he's already cemented the deal. What does that mean, he cemented the deal? That means that if either party backs out, there's a mishapara, and it also means that the other two sellers who have deposits are now free to make other deals without a mishapara and don't have to worry, oh, I have his money, I'm in jeopardy of a mishapara. Mishapara scared people.
So this is what I didn't understand. So the fact that he showed up seals the mishapara, not the kinyan.
Not the kinyan.
So the mishapara, it seals it, and if either party reneges at that point, they're under a mishapara, and they get the reputation that this is who they are. And so I thought it required the kinyan before the mishapara.
No. We're saying that at the point when you transfer money, you already incur the mishapara. But if you gave the money first without the showing up, there's no mishapara. It's only when you have the combination of both of them that there is a mishapara. So Rabbi Yosef is saying it requires a appearance and money. So then the Gemara asks the kasha. So the Gemara says, the circumstance is not what you think it is. It's where money was deposited, but nothing else. So we're going to tell you when money was deposited and nothing else. There is no Mishapara.
So
When
this-
does the Mishapara kick in? When he shows up to that first farmer and says, I want to make a deal, that's when the Mishapara kicks in.
So
But
the seller is
normally-
locked at that point before he shows up, and whoever shows up first, he cannot reject, is what you're
Correct.
saying, because
Correct.
otherwise he's got the
Right. And the other sellers, the other farmers now return the money and there's no Mishapara to them if they can make a better deal with somebody. But if they took money from someone, they can't then turn around and take money from a second person. Someone's already given them a deposit. So those sellers are now locked in to that buyer and at his mercy, so to speak. So he has to finalize a deal with one to release the other two, because the other two have money.
But Rabbi, when you say finalize a deal, is that
I mean, finalize at the level of Mishapara, not
right,
at the
I
king.
understand that. Does that mean that the price is locked at that point, or when
Yes.
the market
Yes.
price is established, that's
No,
what?
no, the price is locked, which is why later when the price goes up, there's no ribbis because
And what if
even
it
though-
goes down?
There's no ribbis. No, there's no ribbis if it goes down. If it goes up, there's no ribbis. But keep in mind that the reason for this is because we have said repeatedly in the Gemara, that one of the ways to get around a ribbis situation is with a fixed price. The question is here, it's too early to have a fixed price. It's in the early stages of harvest, and the fixed price never comes into play. So the Gemara is trying to understand if it doesn't come into play, how do you have a transaction that has ribbis? There shouldn't be ribbis.
So there's risk on both sides at that point. Whatever happens, happens. If whatever deal
Correct.
you cut happens. Okay,
Correct.
I'm sorry if I was slow on the
No,
update,
no,
because
no,
I
no.
thought the
That's
Mishapara
perfect.
only occurred once the sale.
Yeah, so let's just finish these few lines to finish this thought. So if he gives it to 2 or 3 farmers, so if he shows up, then the seller knows that the buyer is going to buy from him, the imlo, and if the buyer doesn't show up, then the seller can say, here's your money back, right? And there's no Mishapara. Why? Because he never showed up. Therefore, Amina Dishkacha Pere, the Shapira Midre V'Shakla. So the seller can say, you know what? You never showed up. I thought you made a deal with someone else. So I went ahead and made a deal with someone else. No Mishapara, because you never showed up. So again, you're going to, what's the time frame? The time frame has to be a reasonable time frame, a day or 2 days, whatever it is. A week goes by, there's no buyer, he doesn't show up, he's left a deposit. The seller now has a deal with somebody else. Is he at the mercy of the first guy until he shows up? The answer is no. The answer is he can now make a deal with somebody else because, again, this guy has to show up. He can't string everybody along for weeks and therefore hold everybody up for making a sale. That doesn't work. So in order for there to be a circumstance where he can lock in, that gives the opportunity for the other people to give back the money. And again, reasonably speaking, if he doesn't show up and the seller has an opportunity to sell to somebody else, he can say, I'm giving the money back to that fellow and I'm going to make a deal with somebody else. There's no Mishapara. Again, this all surrounds the Mishapara, which everybody wants to avoid. And we want to see whether or not we can avoid ribbis in a situation where there's no fixed price in the marketplace. And the answer is yes, that when there's an early sale, you can still have a fixed price without ribbis, but the conditions are that he has to show up and he has to give the money. The Kenyan, of course, will come later, but once he shows up and gives the money, he's already established the framework for a deal, and that's enough for a Mishapara. So that's the answer to the question why Rabbah and Rabbi Hyatt said it wasn't for Kenyan. It wasn't for Kenyan, because if it was a Kenyan, then of course the Gemara says over here, that it can't be for a Kenyan because he didn't make a Kenyan. So how do you get around all this? Because forget about the kinyan. The kinyan we know will come later. We only want to establish the steps that it takes to get to a mishapara is money and showing up. And in the case where there's multiple sellers, he shows up to one of them. That's the deal he makes. And the others he releases, and the others can go ahead and without a mishapara make sales to somebody else. So that's sort of the, we'll go, Mr. Shem, next week much further into this. But again, I don't want to avoid the confusion that you pose a different circumstance, Michael, and in that circumstance, there's a different halacha in terms of multiple, a seller has multiple buyers, but we want to focus just on the situation where one buyer, and certainly if there's one seller, but even if there's multiple sellers, then the showing up is what gives you the imprimatur to make the deal, and then the mishapara kicks in if you break your agreement.
Well,
I think we forgot to do the Tillim today.
What's that?
We didn't say the.
We didn't say Tillim. We didn't say Tillim. Yeah.
Yeah, my fault. I had to get distracted by.
But again, the wonderful discussion, but because everybody was thinking laterally, it's what happens here, what happens there. So it's a good question, but for our purpose, we can only focus on the circumstance that the Gemara wants us to understand is that we're focused on the buyer, what his obligations are. And once the buyer certifies an obligation, that's an obligation for both the buyer and the seller. The seller can't back out either without a mishapara. Once
so
that buyer
was the thinking before this, Rabba and Rabbi Yosef, that the money itself created a mishapara?
Yes. There was a havamina that money created the mishapara. Exactly right. Remember, first level, you and I talk. Second level, I give you money. I don't show up. I give you money. Third level, I make a kinyan. Says Rabbi Yosef, in that middle level that I gave you the money, you also have to show up. That's the chiddush. Because in the middle level, I would have said, I gave you money. It's enough. Teretz is not enough. Giving the money without the showing up doesn't create the imprimatur of a mishapara. Right? And then later with the kinyan, we'll do the kinyan. All right. Do we want to do Tillim quickly? I'm not sure.
We should say it, I think.
Can't hurt, might help. Hang on.
Yeah, we say it in davening. We say it every time in davening here. I don't know if you do.
Yeah, but that's again. Second.
Well, we made Mishaberach, so we should.
We also make a refuah shalema, yeah, for David and for Rabbi Kos.
Yeah.
It's interesting when we make the Mishaberach for Eretz Yisrael. Immediately after the Mishaberach, the Gabe also makes a Mishaberach for Cholin every time. So that one Mishaberach covers, because if you don't lane, then middle of the week you don't make a Mishaberach, but we're saying it all the time. Shir Hamalos, Amakim Klasicha Adinoi,
Hamalos Mimakim Klasicha Adonoi,
Adonoi Shima V'Koli Tino Zecha Kashuva Sokol Tachadunoi,
Shima V'Koli Tino Zecha Kashuva Sokol Tachadunoi,
Imavonos Tishmoyo Adonoi Miyamo,
Imavonos Tishmoyo Adonoi Miyamo,
Im Chasli Cholamanti Bere, Lisi Adonoi Kitso Nafshi B'Lidoi Cholti,
Lisi Adonoi Kitso Nafshi B'Lidoi Cholti,
Nafshi Ladinoi Mishonim Laboike, Shonim Laboike,
Shomrim Laboker,
Yachad Yisrael Adonoi Ki Im Adonoi Chesed V'Harvei Moifedu, Yiftes Yisrael Mikol Aveinoi So,
Yiftes Yisrael Mikol Aveinoi So,
Technical basis Wonderful.